Many of us, when we travel, like to pick up a keepsake to remind us of our journey. Matryoshka nesting dolls are familiar mementos for travelers coming back from Russia. Most often the dolls have an identical character painted on ever smaller versions, one inside the other. As well, you'll find nesting dolls of various singers, ones that are religiously themed, and you can even get them personalized for your own family. Russian nesting dolls in our reading from Isaiah have something in common. Let's take a look. Russian Matryoshka dolls may eventually be painted with beautiful colors, but they start out like this: plain wooden capsules, a blank canvas of sorts, before the artists take them in hand. Now I want you to imagine that God is a skilled Matryoshka painter who paints each of these dolls before us with a representation of the servant about whom we hear in this passage of Scripture. Before painting a specific representation, however, we'll need to focus on the background. Let's sketch out what was going on when this passage was first being heard. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had invaded Judah, sacked Jerusalem, toppled the temple, pillaged the palace, and kidnapped the king, whom he blinded and tossed into a dungeon back in Babylon. But it wasn't just the king who suffered, for the leaders of the people were also removed and exiled in Babylon. Prior to all this, while Jerusalem was still under siege, God, speaking through the prophet Jeremiah, said this: "Now I have given all these lands into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. While the city itself is surrounded," Jeremiah is boldly proclaiming that the enemy, King Nebuchadnezzar, is actually God's servant. Talk about a morale killer. What's the character of this particular servant? For that, I don't have to draw you a picture. We have a sculpted relief from that time showing what the Babylonians did to the Jews, impaling them, often taking 4 or 5 days before the stake would puncture a major organ. Jeremiah is saying that this cruel tyrant is serving God, and by extension, that the exile into which he carried Judah's leadership serves God too. The unfavorable historical circumstances into which the exiles find themselves aren't accidental. God is the Lord of history and will bring about God's good purposes in the end. That's the background that must be sketched in prior to painting anything else on this nested doll. Now that our background has been sketched in, we can move elsewhere. Let's now move to the foreground figure of the servant about whom Isaiah speaks. Today's passage introduces the first of 4 servant songs found in this part of Isaiah. This first song is seen by many scholars as the servant's original call or commissioning. We've seen the character of Nebuchadnezzar. What about the character of this servant in this passage? First off, it begins with an unmitigated exuberance of the Lord for this servant. God burst out with joy. "Here is my servant," or "Looky here." The Hebrew word hen, translated as see, is emphatically positive. God upholds this servant. God's soul delights in this servant. To put it another way, God is tickled pink with this servant, bursting with pride in him. A little further in our reading, God says about the servant, I've called you in righteousness. I've taken you by the hand and kept you. I've given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes of the blind, to bring prisoners sitting in darkness from dungeons. This servant has been called and kept, and is to be a covenant that brings light to the nations, sight to the blind, and freedom to the prisoners. Not only is God exuberant in this servant, but has great expectations too. This is one characteristic of the servant. Now, how will a servant accomplish this task? Through God, who has put his Spirit upon this servant, and he'll faithfully bring forth justice to the nations and won't grow faint until he has established justice in the earth. This servant will be one who establishes justice around the world. Now, when most of us think of justice, it has punitive and retributive connotations. We'll bring the evildoers to justice. Let the punishment fit the crime. The defendant must pay for his crimes, and justice demands it. This servant, however, will bring about a different kind of justice, not retributive, but restorative. He won't cry out or lift up his voice in the street. He won't break bruised reeds or quench smoldering wicks. In the words of the message, he won't call attention to what he does with loud speeches and gaudy parades. He won't brush aside the bruised and hurt or disregard the small and insignificant. Through God's Spirit, this servant will establish justice quietly, gently, peacefully. Through his own humility and compassion, God's nonviolent justice is brought forth to the nations. This servant's character will be more of a bruised reed than a lash, more of a smoldering wick than a firebrand. A second characteristic of this servant is that he'll work tirelessly to establish God's brand of justice worldwide. A third characteristic of his servant is that the coastlands waits for his teachings. The former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. The servant will be a teacher whose instructions will be longed for in distant coastlands and throughout the world. The way things were once done is now over. New things are happening, and God has given a preview of what's to come. God's servant will be the one to usher in this newness. The foreground figure of the servant has come into focus. God is exuberant in this servant and has great expectations. This Spirit-empowered servant will work tirelessly to bring forth justice, God's nonviolent justice on earth. This servant's teachings will be longed for around the world, and he'll help usher in God's newness. Before the servant was revealed, we had to sketch in some characteristics of that servant. At last, God is ready to put paint on brush and brush to wood, but whose face will God paint there? After all, the author of this servant song doesn't name who the servant is. We're in the dark about who this servant could be. Then we remember this is only the first of 4 servant songs in Isaiah. And like nesting dolls, when we open them, we may be surprised by the identities we uncover. The background to our first figure is the exile's conditions. Disconnected from their homeland, struggling to keep the faith, and constantly reminded of all that they had lost and all that they were enduring in the present. It was a pretty pitiful picture. Yet it's within precisely that sad state of affairs that Isaiah speaks of a servant. The people must have wondered, who could it be? From what family is he? Is he here among us now, or will he be here soon? And God says, watch me as I paint, and you'll find out. And God dips brush to paint and begins filling in the foreground figure, and the people say, hey, that looks like us. Are you sure, Lord? And God replies, remember, I've called you in righteousness. Remember, I've taken you by the hand and kept you. Remember, I've given you as a covenant to the people. Remember, you are a light to the nations. You'll give sight to the blind and free prisoners from dark dungeons. And showing the nesting doll to the exiles, God points to them and says, here is my servant. And indeed, throughout chapters 40 through 48 of Isaiah, Israel is referred to as the servant of God. God is reminding them that even in exile, especially in exile, the covenant holds. Their original call is still valid. God has been holding their hand all along. Their light to the nations hasn't dimmed, and their mission to share God's teachings and establish God's justice on earth still holds. As we look back over millennia of history, we can indeed see that Israel has been that servant of God, opening the eyes of people around the world to the one true God and God's justice desired for this world. As author Thomas Cahill in his book, The Gifts of the Jews says, when Abraham hears the voice of God speaking the unexpected words, go forth, the concept of an unknown future takes hold, and Western civilization is born. For them, time had a beginning and an end. It was a narrative whose triumphant conclusion would come in the future. From this insight came a new conception of men and women as individuals with unique destinies, a conception that would inform the Declaration of Independence and our hopeful belief in progress and the sense that tomorrow can be better than today. One servant portrait is Israel in exile. But there are other nesting dolls to paint. Fast forward 70 years, and we see the city of Babylon itself surrounded by armies of another king named Cyrus from Persia. Cyrus was tireless in his efforts to expand his empire, but he wasn't a bloodthirsty conqueror. He brought a different kind of justice to those he conquered. He established the largest empire of its time on earth, stretching from the coastlands of Turkey all the way to the Indus River in India. He was known as Cyrus the Great because of his enlightened policies in battle as well as ruling. Rather than destroying Babylon and its inhabitants, Cyrus negotiated with the Babylonian generals to obtain a compromise and avoid an armed conflict, taking the city without violence. He then assumed control of all that Babylon once held, including the Jews in the city. Before leaving Babylon, Cyrus issued his Edict of Restoration, which brought the Jewish prisoners out of dungeons and promised them funds from the Persian treasury to go and return back home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The exiles must have wondered, could the servant be? And God replied, watch me as I paint, and you'll find out. And God dips paint to brush and begins filling in the foreground figure, and the people say, hey, that looks like Cyrus. Are you sure, Lord? After all, he's a foreigner who doesn't acknowledge you as Lord. And yet later in Isaiah, God calls Cyrus my shepherd, who shall carry out my purpose, and my anointed, which in Hebrew means my Messiah, whom God promises to make his paths straight. If a bloodthirsty conqueror like Nebuchadnezzar could be God's servant, how much more so then is Cyrus a servant of God? God shows the nesting doll to the exiles and pointing to Cyrus says with joy, "Here is my servant." Another servant portrait is King Cyrus the Great. But there are other nesting dolls to paint. Fast forward over 550 years into the future. The background has changed considerably, yet it involved the Jewish people once again. They're back in their homeland. The temple has long been rebuilt, and King Herod has expanded the Temple Mount to be the largest in the world. The Persian Empire is a thing of the past. Now Rome controls Israel. And a man about 30 years of age goes to the Jordan River and is baptized, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased," echoing the opening of Isaiah 42, where it says, "Here is my servant, my chosen, in whom my soul delights." He's the servant of the Lord with God's Spirit upon him, the one who will faithfully bring forth justice in a nonviolent way. Jesus will be a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, who will give sight to the blind and bring prisoners out of dungeons. His teachings will astonish, and many will long for them and for the newness of which he speaks. The people then surely wondered, could the servant really be him? And God replied, "Watch me as I paint, and you'll find out." And God dips brush to paint and begins filling in the foreground figure, and people say, "Hey, that looks like Jesus." "Are you sure, Lord?" After all, he comes with some questionable parentage from a backwater town. He hangs out with prostitutes and tax collectors. His own family thinks he's nuts. And when he washes the feet of his disciples, even they don't picture him as a servant. And yet, Matthew takes today's passage as proof that Jesus is that servant. For as he says, many crowds followed Jesus, and he cured all of them. This was to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah, "Here is my servant, whom I have chosen." God shows the nesting doll to us, and pointing to it with joy, says, "Here is my servant." Another servant portrait is Jesus of Nazareth. But there's one more nesting doll to paint. Fast forward 2,000 years to the present. The background has changed remarkably since ancient Palestine. The Roman Empire and many others are things of the past. Now America is the ruling empire of the world. And the church, strangely enough, finds an odd resemblance between our present and the experience of those exiles in the past. We find ourselves marginalized from the larger culture, struggling to keep the faith, constantly reminded of all that we've lost in the past and what we're enduring in the present. The unfavorable historical circumstances in which we find ourselves aren't accidental. our exile serves God's purposes. Although it's a pretty pitiful picture, it's within precisely this sad state of affairs that Isaiah continues speaking of a servant. We wonder, who could it be? And God says, watch me as I paint, and you'll find out. And God dips brush to paint and begins filling in the foreground figure, and the people say, hey, that looks like us. Are you sure, Lord? And God replies, remember, I've called you in righteousness. Remember, I've taken you by the hand and kept you. Remember, I've put my Spirit upon you. Remember, I've given you as a covenant to the people. Remember, you are a light to the nations, and you will open the eyes of the blind, and you will free prisoners from dungeons. God is reminding us that in our exile, especially in our exile, the covenant holds. Our original call is still valid. God's been holding our hand all along. Our light to the nations hasn't dimmed, and our mission to share God's teachings and establish God's justice on earth still holds. And showing the nesting doll to the church, God points to us with joy and says, here is my servant. You are my ongoing masterpiece, about whom I'm exuberant and have great expectations. Empowered by my Spirit, you will continue bringing justice to the earth. Go into all nations and teach them all that I have commanded you, until I come again and make all things new. And may each of us one day find our portrait painted by God, who says to us, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. Amen. If you're ready to become the